your words.
We're testing.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. I do apologize for the delay, but I thank you for your patience. My name is Angelina Wong. I am a senior here at WAU, Washington Adventist University, and I am actually completing my bachelor's in music as we speak, whereas this major project is part of that graduation requirement. So I'm very excited to show you my research on numerology. As mentioned in your program, number symbolism, also known as numerology, has been considered a mystical belief for centuries. It is the belief that numbers carry meaning other than quantity. In religion, this appears in significant biblical scenes, such as the three-in-one idea of Jesus Christ as a member of the Trinity and being one with God. In music, the symbolic use of numbers to represent such concepts has been observed as early as the 16th century in Giovanni Palestrina's Pope Marcellus Mass, and in many research projects on Johann Sebastian Bach's Mass in B minor. After that lesson in 2022, where I learned about numerology, that professor explained some of that numerology that I sang for him in the Domine Deus, which you will hear tonight. After that lesson, I began analyzing the rest of Vivaldi's Gloria to determine the extent to which Vivaldi used numerical symbols. It was everywhere, actually all 12 movements. Unfortunately, this presentation does not exhaust all of my analyses, but it will highlight common symbols in 4 movements, and will conclude with a demonstration in the form of a concert. I hope you enjoy. Oop, too much. Can you? Oopsie, I am so sorry. There it is. Okay. Numerology is the attachment of meaning to numbers and number patterns based on divine or mystical power. Observations appear by counting frequencies, such as notes in the melody, the number of notes in the melody, the number of repetitions, the number of beats, and the number of measures. This is essentially how Bach applied numerology in his compositions, such as setting the credo in his B minor Mass in 9 movements to create a 3 times 3 symbol to represent the Trinity. But musicologists observed similar numerical symbolisms as early as the 16th century with Palestrina's Pope Marcellus Mass. There it is. In Palestrina's work, as you can also see in your handout, one notices many numerical representations of the Trinity through his treatment of the number 3. 3-part textures, repetitions and multiples of 3, and intervals of thirds, 6s, which is an inverted third, and tenths, which is an octave with a third on top. Since numerology as a musical tool existed between the 16th and 18th centuries, this project aims to observe its use in Vivaldi's Gloria in D major, which I will call the Gloria for the rest of this presentation. All musical excerpts in this paper are sourced from Vivaldi's Gloria, published by Casa Ricordi, and his autographed manuscript available on IMSLP. All translations of the text from the Gloria are my own. I will admit that for this presentation, I will use contralto and alto interchangeably, even though Vivaldi wrote contralto in his score. Also, I am aware of the practice of ornamenting in early music. However, in order to avoid distorting the numerology, we will intentionally not ornament except for occasional trills, especially those indicated in the manuscript. My goal in the performance is to showcase the numerology in the Gloria in its most basic form. Antonio Vivaldi of Venice, Italy, was a violin virtuoso and a devout Catholic. Michael Talbot, an expert on Vivaldi, documents Vivaldi's life in much detail, estimating the age of his religious training, beginning as early as about 15 and a half years and accumulating in his ordination to priest at age 25 in 1703. In the same year, Vivaldi began his employment with the Pietà, where he worked as a teacher and composer. In 1737, he requested dispensation from the Catholic Church due to a medical condition, probably asthma, that prevented him from saying Mass. Despite his illness, he continued to serve the Church by composing sacred music, of which the Gloria, a setting of the Mass Ordinary, is one of the best known. As part of his education, Vivaldi learned plain song and Latin, both of which he knew so well that he used each with ease. To the shock of all witnesses, Vivaldi was known to step away from the altar or put down his breviary to work on music. Talbot came to the logical conclusion then that Vivaldi must have enjoyed combining these two elements in his life, and I quote, "It seems reasonable to suppose that Vivaldi derived great personal satisfaction from combining and reconciling the two most important elements of his background through the composition of music for the Church." there is ample evidence that Vivaldi was a symbolic and versatile composer. Mark Pinkerel describes Vivaldi as, I quote again, an impressionist very much ahead of his time, and lists many works that exemplify his tone painting. We today recognize that tone painting in Vivaldi's Le Stagioni, the seasons, or the four seasons, some might know it by that name, with examples such as staccato articulations to represent rain and jagged musical lines to represent lightning. The nature, then, of the person and his music invites the hypothesis that he applied numerology to his sacred works. A research project needs research questions. Naturally, the first is, what numbers did Vivaldi use and in what manner? Additional questions are, for what purpose do these numbers appear? To what extent did Vivaldi use numerology? And how can musicians apply this information to their score study and performance? This presentation will describe numerical symbols in 4 of the Gloria's movements: 3, the Laudamus Te; 6, the Domine Deus; 7, Domine Fili chorale; and 10, the Quisedes. In the interest of time, I will observe only numbers 2, 3, 12, and 24, which respectively represent the concepts of duality, which is 2, the Trinity, which is 3, the tribes of Israel, or the apostles, which is 12, and the complete church, which is the combination of the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles around the seat of Christ. Following this presentation, my colleagues and I will perform these movements to showcase how applying numerology to performance affects the phrasing and interpretation. You will hear some phrases and articulations that may run contrary to common practice. So I really applaud my friends for relearning these movements to reflect the numerology. Let's begin with the number 2. In the third movement of the Gloria, that's the Laudamus Te soprano duet, Vivaldi uses the number 2 symbolically by orchestrating for duet sopranos, restricting the composition to a 2-part rhythmic texture, using 2 unique rhythmic ideas in the first 2 melismas, and using a single repetition in the first and third melismas. You'll see later that the third and fourth melismas are essentially identical. And for those in the audience who might need a definition, a melisma in music is a syllable that's sung on multiple notes. Okay. Figure 2 here and in your handout is a section towards the beginning of the third movement. We see the orchestration, the duet soprano, the violins who share the same line, the viola, and a continuo section. Which, the continuo, by the way, in tonight's concert will be made up of a cello, a double bass, and a harpsichord. I highlighted the 2 rhythmic textures in blue and orange to reveal how, despite having potentially 5 unique lines of music, Vivaldi restricts himself to 2, which encourages the theory that this 2-ness was intentional. So if we could see here, please help me out for a moment. Is my laser clear? Okay, cool. So if we see here, in the first measure or so, the violins and the continuo in the first beat have 2/8 notes, and the viola has a quarter. And then the violins have the quarter, but then the viola and the continuo have the 8 notes. And they kind of keep doing that. And then even later, when the violin has a more unique melody, the other instruments are doing the same rhythm anyway. So you can see very clearly how even when new instruments, even when the voices come in, the rhythmic texture is still limited to 2. There's nothing more than a 1-2, 1-2, where the blue represents the one that these guys are sharing, and the orange is representing the other one. Here we see the 2 iconic ideas in this movement, the stepwise motion under number 1, that's da 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 da, yeah, and the 8th, 16th, 16th rhythm under number 2, which is here. It goes da 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 da, yeah. The circled rest in the soprano 1 part, where's the circle? There it is. The circled rest in the soprano 1 part suggests that Vivaldi intended these ideas to be separate. Additionally, we see Vivaldi's use of a singular repetition to create 2 iterations of each idea. In the first system, there is an exact repetition of the second rhythmic idea. So the second rhythmic idea is this, on the soprano 1 line, da 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 da, and the soprano 2, da 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 da. But then you see, immediately after, they repeat the same thing exactly once, and only once. The second system shows each idea in a variation. So this number 1 correlates to this number 1. It's the same stepwise motion, but now instead of doing da-da-da-da, they are doing da-da-da-da-da-da-da, so it's going up and down, not just straight up. And number 2, the variation is now the 8th note is just a dotted quarter, right? The 2/16ths are still there. You will hear the theme and variation in the soprano line when we have the concert, when she breaks for the quarter rest, which is here. And also in the soprano 2 line when she lifts at the same time to coordinate with the first. So you will hear this rest, but also a slight break here. So then you'll hear the first idea, the variation of the first idea, and the variation of the second later. Figure 4 shows the last 2 melismas in this movement. The interesting thing to notice is that they are essentially identical because the lines are just flipped, pardoning this last note here, whose rhythmic value is just different. So the first time it's a quarter note, the second time it's a half note. Otherwise, the lines are identical, right? So soprano 1 has this phrase starting on the D, and then it gets flipped. So the soprano 2 will have that D later, the same line. The soprano 2 had the E, that line, and then later the soprano 1 took it and sang everything identically. In essence, Vivaldi creates an exact repetition, and therefore 2 iterations of this passage, enhancing the sense of duality by having the 2 sopranos sing each other's lines. There we go. In the 6th movement, the Domine Deus soprano solo, Vivaldi similarly symbolizes the number 2 through a sequence of the melodic idea in the first melisma and an exact repetition of the motif in the third melisma. This slide shows both examples. In figure 5, we have the original melodic idea under 1, and its sequence up a step under 2. So we see that it's a third and then a scale down, and then it's just a higher note, but it's still the same third and then scale down. In figure 6, down here, the original melodic idea under 1 is repeated exactly under 2. So this is what we call an exact repetition. Exact repetition. So we have this line, and immediately afterwards she sings it again. Also the oboe. You will hear in the performance the soprano solo lifting between the 2 iterations of each motif to emphasize the 2 parts. The number 3 is the most common numerical symbol and appears in all of the movements I analyzed in this project. In the third movement, that's the Laudamus Te, it appears in Vivaldi's orchestration of 3 instrumental families, which are voice, strings, and continuo. 3 iterations of the full text here, Laudamus Te, Benedicimus Te, Adoramus Te, Glorificamus Te. Parallel thirds. There are also 3 sequences in each melismatic passage, or in various melismatic passages rather, and a unique triplet figure that only occurs here. The manuscript shows the instrumentation most clearly. So here we can see a distinct string section, which are these top 2 lines, the soprano duet, which are these next 2 lines, and the continuo section, which is its own line down here. Everyone shares that one line. And we know it's continuo because of that figured bass on top. He drew his figured basses on top. Later, Vivaldi repeats the offset, this is figure 8, yes. In figure 8, we see the duet sopranos singing in parallel thirds homophonically, and then later dramatically offset. So homophonic means that the sounds happen at the same time. Here. So, for example, we see that the thirds, the D and this F, happen at the same time. The C and the E, the B and the D. These are thirds, and because they move together, it's called a parallel third. Yeah, and there should be no surprise that there are exactly 3 of these. Later, Vivaldi repeats the offset technique. So this offset technique, earlier, it's here. So earlier they were together, and then later, the soprano 2 sings this E, and then she goes to a D, while the soprano 1 suspends this F. So in the beginning, it's going to sound like a really crunchy second, but then when soprano 2 resolves down to this D, then this is where the third is, and you will hear it briefly at this spot, and at this spot. Exactly 3. Oops. And yes, then later, Vivaldi repeats this offset technique. When he flips the soprano's lines, they create parallel sixths, but given the pitch notation and the matching soprano instrumentation, the listener will hear essentially the same lines, right? Because they're both sopranos, and they sing like sopranos. So the notes are going to sound basically the same the first time you hear it and the second time you hear it. It's just that it's going to come out of a different mouth. When he flips the soprano lines, they create the parallel sixths, but you'll still hear the parallel thirds. And because of the way this is set up, you do it once and then you do it again with the flip. It happens twice. So this is therefore also representing that 3 times 3 idea of the Trinity. Let's zoom in for a moment on the sequences I mentioned earlier. For the stepwise motion, that's the da-da-da-da-da-da, Vivaldi introduces a motif and then sequences it 3 times. Remember, 3 times 3 is a symbol for the Trinity. So we see here in purple the motif and the fact that he does it 3 times. And again here with the variation. That was the motif, the step, and then he does it 3 times. Additionally, the number 3 itself could represent the Trinity, as seen in the 3 repetitions of this dotted quarter 8/8 idea, a variation of the 8/16/16 idea earlier, the da-da-da-da-da, which you can find in your handout in figure 3, but it's also, the variation is here. So there are 1, 2, 3. That's the Trinity. Pardon me. There it is. Later, Vivaldi combines these 2 ideas in these last 2 melismas. The numerology from earlier in this lecture reveals more clearly the motif Vivaldi introduced in its 3 sequences, in effect creating the idea of the Trinity by sequencing 3 times, not once here, but twice here. I can't help but also point out the soprano 2's unique take on the Trinity by singing a set of triplets. This is the only movement that features a triplet figure, so it seems the number 3 is very important in this movement. The triplet figure is here. The idea of the Trinity can appear through some use of 3, either on its own or by multiplying itself. In the 6th movement, which is the Domine Deus soprano solo, Vivaldi represents 3 as itself by reciting the 3 titles of God. Here, Domine Deus, Rex Celestis, Deus Pater Omnipotens. He also has the soprano singing 3 iterations of the full text, and by full text I mean all of these titles at once, so back to back. He orchestrates for 3 instrumental families, if not literally for 3 instruments in an extreme chamber group, and using 3-note motivic ideas and parallel thirds. Again, the manuscript shows the instrumentation most clearly. In the Baroque style in early music, the continuo section could have been made up of more than one instrument, usually a keyboard and something with bass strings. But they performed as a unit and read from the same line of music. That's why Vivaldi and other Baroque composers wrote the score this way, which happens to help us see the orchestration of the 3 different sections, even if the obbligato line were a violin. So, sorry it's cut out here, but this top line is the solo, it's the obbligato line, which could be an oboe or a violin. The second line is the soprano solo, and this bottom line is the continuo section. According to Michael Talbot, it was traditional in Italian sacred music to feature an obbligato instrument. And since the techniques of this obbligato line doesn't cater to either an oboe or a violin, it really doesn't matter which one to use. If a director chooses to feature an oboe, that would symbolize a more unique instrumental family, so that the orchestration becomes winds, voice, and continuo. The second and fourth melismas in this movement feature 3-note motivic ideas highlighted here in green, and it's also in your handout if you want to see the full figure. So the idea is this, given the back-to-back nature of this melisma, the second melisma actually, which is my top line here, it is possible to group the notes in 2 ways, both of which exemplify the number 3. Most sopranos opt for the second option here because the descending scale is an obvious motif. But for tonight's performance, we'll emphasize the first interpretation, which is this tied note and then the scale, but the tied note and then the scale. So we'll start with the tie. I'll explain why later under number 12. But we see here how, either way, right? This first motif with the tied note, starting with the tied note, it takes up 3 notes, again 3 notes, again 3 notes, again 3 notes. And even if you interpreted it with the scale having the emphasis, the scale is a 3-note scale. 3 notes, 3 notes. Now this melisma here, the last one, the idea is the 3-note scale. It's definitely the 3-note scale. So 3 notes up, 3 notes down, 3 notes up, 3 notes down, so far so forth. Even when it's tied, the tie happens at the 3rd note, and then it resets. So the idea of 3 is still here. When the soprano sings their 3rd and 4th melismas, the orchestra, first the oboe and then the continuo, plays in parallel thirds with her, twice, enforcing the trinity. You should be able to hear these thirds suddenly when the oboe and then the continuo section plays homophonically with the soprano. From the continuo section, my opinion, it might be easier to pick out the 3-note motif in the cello part. So this first line, it got cut off, but this first line is the soprano with the oboe. You see the parallel thirds. And this bottom line is the soprano with the continuo section. So you see that both are doing the 3-note scale motif. And they line up in thirds. All right. In the 7th movement, that's Domine Fili chorale, Vivaldi uses the number 3 by having a time signature in 3. There are 3 major sections marked by perfect authentic cadences and homophony on the text Jesu Christe, and a 3-note rhythmic ideas. All the ideas actually have 3 notes in them. For figure 16, I extracted the 3 sections of the movement marked by perfect authentic cadences, which are highlighted here in green. They happen to also end on the text Jesu Christe, here, and here. Perfect authentic cadences, by the way, is a special kind of chord progression that makes the music sound complete. It should be no coincidence that there are exactly 3. early on, Early on in this movement, the orchestra introduces three motivic ideas rampant throughout this movement. The first is the Lombard rhythm, which is a dotted eighth with a 16th, which according to Mark Pinkerel is a rhythm used in folk music that Vivaldi used often in its original form and reversed. So it's usually a dotted eighth, 16th, but then sometimes he'll use a 16th and then a dotted eighth. This upbeat dance-like the upbeat dance-like nature of this rhythm gives the representation, this gives the impression of a child at play, tone painting the text fili, which means sun in Latin, when the choir begins to sing. The violin gives that motif, and also the viola in the continuo section. The second idea here in yellow is metrical. It's a metrical idea, it's a rhythmic idea, by combining a quarter note with a half note to create 3 beats. So quarter note is 1, half note is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3. This simple pattern must fill the space of 3 beats, even across the bar line, as seen here in the violin 1 part, in order to represent Jesus as a member of the Trinity. The third motif, introduced in the second violin line, is a descending triad. It's always descending, and it appears mostly in the viola and tenor lines, even though the second violin introduces it. Now, for you, I especially requested the viola since she has this motif more often to bring it out, so you will hear this. Figure 18 is a compilation of all occurrences of the 3-beat motif using quarters and half notes. Remember that Vivaldi was fluent in Latin, yet here he ignores the natural phonological stresses of certain words, particularly Jesu and fili. So for example, let me see if I can find it. Yes, the soprano one, for example, she sings Jesu with a quarter and then a half note, but then later she sings Jesu again with a half note and then a quarter. And then, for example, fili, the bass has fili with a half note and then a quarter note here. But then, just a little bit earlier, he sang a quarter note and then a half note. So clearly, the text stress doesn't matter. What he was aiming for was a 3-beat idea, just to fill up the space of 3 beats. He was more concerned about emphasizing that idea than respecting the language's phonology. The third idea, mentioned earlier, is a descending triad, this descending triad. This pattern always descends, which often represents objects falling to earth, such as Jesus being born as a man. The second violin introduces this idea, but the viola plays it for the rest of the movement, beginning at measure 376. The tenor is the only voice part with this idea, and they sing it 3 times. And I actually point them all out here with the T. That's the tenor section. They sing it once, twice, 3 times. You will hear that especially because the viola will be doubling them. So this motif will come out in the tenor section. You will hear it. In the 10th movement, the qui sedes alto solo. This movement only uses the number 3 as its numerical symbol. It uses a 3/8 time signature. There are 3 iterations of the full text, which are qui sedes ad dexteram patris miserere nobis. There are 3 repetitions of the word miserere for every iteration of the full text. Remember, full text for me means that she sings this entire line without pause. There are 3 hemiolas, and there are 3 repetitions of rhythmic ideas. Figure 20 is a compilation of the contralto's text to reveal how the soloist sings the full text 3 times and repeats the word miserere for each iteration of the full text. So it's cut out here, but it's more clear in your handout. The first iteration of the full text will start with the qui sedes, and then she sings the miserere once, twice, 3 times. The second time we see the quiseres, but then she sings the miserere 1 time. But hold on, hold that in the back of your mind for a moment. The third time she sings the quiseres, she will sing the miserere once, rest for 2 measures, sing the miserere twice, and then the third time. And then later here we see her sing, or rather you will hear her sing the miserere 3 times, as if to make up for the second iteration of the full texts, when she only sang that miserere 1 time. This wouldn't be the Trinity, after all, without the 3rd time, right? That's the point. Figure 21 is a compilation of all of the hemiolas in this movement, which are rhythms whose natural stresses don't match the time signature. In 3, usually only the first beat gets the emphasis, so it would go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But here in this hemiola, we will see there are 3 quarters making up the hemiola, and it upsets the rhythm a little bit. So it will go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's a beat thing, you'll feel it. I glossed it earlier, but there are 3 quarters for each of the 3 hemiolas. 3 times 3, making the Trinity. 3 repetitions on a variation of the original rhythmic idea labeled here occur twice in the alto's melisma. Figure 22 has the first one, so we have her melisma is this first one. The idea is under 1. She repeats it. A sequence is down a step, and then again down another step. So this is the first time. This is the second time. Very similar. 1, 2, 3. I would like to draw attention also to how the orchestra joins in symbolizing the Trinity by dividing their parts into 3 sections that coincide with the singers. So I also color-coded them just to make it easier to find. The original rhythmic idea here is in the upper strings, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and then at the same time the contralto sings her first melisma, her first idea. And then underneath you will hear these 3 quarter notes in the continuo section. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Not once, but twice. 3 times 3. Yeah. There is one more use of the number 3 in the Gloria, which I like to call the Peter section. In the middle of the 7th movement, which is the Domine Fili chorale, Vivaldi introduces a descending scale with a quarter note and 4/8 notes that seem to represent Jesus' disciple Peter. It goes by very quickly, but you'll hear it when the music suddenly sounds dark and foreboding, like something went really wrong. This idea appears in the soprano and alto lines, highlighted here. So here's the first time it happens. This is the quarter with the descending 8th notes, again with the alto, and then the third time goes back to the soprano. This motif is drastically different from the other motives introduced earlier in figure 17, which represents some aspect of Jesus. This is why I argue that this motif must represent someone else. And it is significant because it occurs 3 times. So this is just figure 17 again. Remember this jaunty Lombard rhythm from figure 17 that represents Jesus as a child. The 3-beat rhythm recognizes, right, this one, 3-beat rhythmic motif recognizes Jesus as a member of the Trinity. The descending triad, besides having 3 notes, also paints the picture of Jesus descending to earth as a man. In comparison, these descending scales are really different, not to mention highly chromatic or tonally unstable, so it can't represent Jesus, who should be perfect. It is also important to observe that the chorus does not sing the name Jesu Christe until the cadence at the end of this section marked in purple. Here's his name. Jesu Christe, Jesu Christe, Jesu Christe, and Jesu Christe. These characteristics suggest that this passage tells the story of Peter when he denied his love of Jesus 3 times and then later made up for it. Each descending scale is a denial, 1, 2, 3, where the downward motion suggests moving further away from heaven and representing tragedy, as described in Johann Mattheson's Doctrine of Affections, which I found referenced in Vahe Aslanian's dissertation at Stanford University. Vivaldi accentuates the downward motion by sequencing the idea by a fifth. And the last is transposed up to accommodate the vocal range of the soprano. So I don't know if you could see it up here, but you should definitely see it in your handouts. How the first time this motif is sung, it starts on this F. When the contralto, when the altos pick it up, they'll sing it on a B flat. That's a fifth below an F. And then a fifth below a B, if we were to count backwards in the alphabet, that's an E flat, specifically an E flat. Which, if the soprano was to sing that E flat, then her lowest note would be the low A, and that's just cruel. So no, Vivaldi transposed that up an octave. So she will sing the E flat, but it's higher up. The distant keys noted by the blue chord analysis above these lines gives the impression of straying, just as when Peter grieved at Jesus' prophecy and fled. The reaffirmation of Peter's love begins when the chorus sings a 3-part Jesu and a 3-part homophonic Christe on a major third across all voice parts. The fifth only appears in the viola part, which we'll see in figure 25. This is it. Please pardon the tiny font and the overlap. The images are enlarged in your handout. And the viola's F is this one down here with the alto clef. Go all the way to the end, that's an F. And that's the only F. So that's how we know what kind of a chord this is, but she's the only one who has the F. Yes, and in this chord, the F is the fifth, which is why it's not emphasized. The emphasis is on the third, so everyone else is either singing the root or the third. That's why there's only one F there. Figure 25 is the entire Peter section. You will hear in the concert how the orchestra doubles the chorus throughout this movement, except in this section. It is highly chromatic and troubling, except to some extent